Okay. Huh?
Might be interesting. Anyway.
Andrew, nice to meet you.
Yeah. I mean, okay. Please take your seats for the final round of our conference. So, outside. Other people outside. Yeah. Okay, I think we are ready to start. What I wanted to say is we will have a shorter panel than the other panels, and from our schedule we will have a little bit of time, and I thought what might be appropriate, since we've had a very excellent panels, but they were also often quite diverse, and so I think it might make sense to have at the end a kind of a more general discussion about the things we touched upon. And so what I want to do is kind of combine my concluding remarks with the kind of giving just some ideas to spark the discussion, and then we have kind of that everybody can participate in this final round and touch upon more general questions. So now I'm pleased to hand over to Sarah McPherson, who is a very well-known scholar in this field here at USC, and she will introduce herself.
Thank you, Wolf. I'm Tara McPherson. I'm a professor in the School of Cinematic Arts and also work on a platform called Scalar, which is a digital humanities platform. And I'm very excited to hear the papers today. So we will follow the same format that has been in place. We will hear the first paper, have a chance for Q&A, and then hear the second paper, which has 3 authors, right? So we'll move that way. So first up is Joanna Cham, who is the lead for emerging literacies librarian across town at UCLA, where she creates and supports digital scholarship and work around emerging literacies instruction. Before UCLA, Joanna was a librarian here at USC in the LA Subject Archive, which is a very fascinating initiative here on campus, and which included rotations through many places in the region as a librarian. She's also previously worked for the Shoah Foundation as a testimony indexer and has held a number of fellowships and awards in various places. So welcome.
Hello? Okay, just have to hold it closer. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Joanna Cham. I'm the UCLA Lead for Emerging Literacies Librarian, and today I'll be speaking on incorporating emerging literacies into digital approaches to genocide studies, understanding the value systems, methodologies, and choices behind the metadata. So first of all, what is emerging literacies? If you think about traditional literacies, learning how to read and write. If you talk to librarians and talk about information literacy, you're thinking about how to search and find and use information. So emerging literacies is the idea that we're all creating and consuming information, and that's changing in a lot of different ways due to innovation, collaboration with research and technology, and that's expanding to different formats, different times, and we're seeing that a lot in the conference so far, right? We're looking at mapping and videos and different types of narratives, and as those mediums continue to change and those formats continue to change, it's increasingly important to introduce and equip students and people in general to discover, understand, use, engage information in different modes, and learn how to create as well, whether it's storytelling, as we've seen, mapping, as we've seen, data analysis, visualization, in order to empower them to think more creatively and critically and collaboratively as well. So just a little bit of background. My background, I started out studying history and Jewish studies when I was in my undergrad, and I actually ended up working at the Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust, which, if you haven't been, is a great museum, has a lot of great artifacts and exhibits. And I actually was there for about 4.5 years working in archives, exhibits, and processing archival materials there. After that, I decided to go back to school, and I also was working at the Shoah Foundation, so I did some Holocaust education work while I was there, and then later on did Nanjing Massacre testimony indexing, where I was trained by Crispin Brooks, and also was able to kind of learn about the indexing behind the visual history archive that I had always used before, actually, in my own research. While I was at UCLA, I also had a chance to work with Todd Presner, who you all heard yesterday, from the UCLA Center for Jewish Studies. And also working here at USC Libraries, I had the opportunity to work just across the hallway here at Doheny Library in Special Collections. So all to say, I'm a librarian now, but I'm a former archivist and curator, Holocaust educator, and Nanjing Massacre testimony indexer, current academic librarian, and also digital humanist, and that's kind of where I'm coming from. So when we're in archives, we always talk about being reflective and reflexive and being clear with where we come from, so I just wanted to present that first. And I just wanted to explain a little bit what Lead for Emerging Literacies librarian means as I continue to talk about how to incorporate emerging literacies. So in terms of emerging literacies, my job is to create and deliver and support digital scholarship and undergraduate instruction. And what that means is working with faculty and instructors to look at digital projects. Maybe they go to a conference like this, they see something awesome, they want to incorporate into their classroom work or curriculum. Maybe they've done a project or seen a colleague done a project, but they're unsure of what resources we have on campus at UCLA, what equipment we have available for them. Do we have GoPros? Do we have videos? Do we have iPads? Do we have the software that's needed to edit these types of projects? Do we have the expertise and people to help support them? And then how do we scaffold emerging literacies within that, whether it's visual literacy, archival literacy, et cetera? So in talking about how to incorporate emerging literacies, I wanted to start by taking a closer look at the metadata. And within that, as I said earlier, it's understanding the value systems, the methodology, and the choices behind the metadata. So when we're taking a closer look at the metadata, some examples of where we can find that obviously is in archival collection finding aids, where you're looking at archival description. You have catalog records. GIS, you're looking at maps and boundaries, you're looking at archival description, and then you're just looking at metadata or indexing keywords, for example, from the VHA. And so within value systems, we have to think about teaching our students to ask questions about content. Do they have content knowledge? Are they being asked to prepare just a project, but are they also being equipped for content knowledge? We heard earlier Andrew was talking about how his project wouldn't have been possible without the researcher who already had the little black notebook of contacts and who already had the cultural competency and the content knowledge for that. So how do we ask students to interrogate that when they're looking at the finding aids, when they're trying to visualize a data set? And then looking also at methodology. So in archives, many times we do MPLP, more product, less processing. Sometimes you have item level description when you're at a smaller institution, but many times it is MPLP, meaning that as archivists, I'm sure you've all seen our many, many boxes on the shelves and the many, many boxes that are on the book carts behind the shelves. And so there's too much, there's a backlog. If it is MPLP, then we're also looking at choices, right? So the economics of it, what gets funded, what doesn't get funded, how does that affect what metadata is available, what data sets are available, and do donors have an influence in terms of what does get funded and what we're prioritizing. And that also goes to looking at methodology in terms of like the VHA when I was an indexer, looking at the cataloging and indexing guidelines. So when I was an indexer, I felt like actually everyone who was using the VHA should actually be trained as an indexer too, because I learned so much more intimately how the keywords were being applied minute by minute, and I was applying them minute by minute. And so I got to learn the thesaurus really well. I got to learn what all the different priorities were and what the guidelines and methodology was behind that. And that helped me to actually navigate the system much better as well. And going back to choices as well is the data source and availability. So when we're asking students or graduate students to look at visualizing the metadata and looking at these digital approaches, are we teaching them to go delve deep into the data source? Are they starting from just collecting the source and organizing it, or are they going back to interrogating and asking, critically thinking about where are these data sources coming from, what's available, and why is that available? So in terms of how to incorporate emerging literacies into all of that, that starts with looking at, in terms of, let's start with value systems. In order to have more content knowledge and cultural competencies, you have to have more diversity to begin with in the field. For example, archivists nationwide are still very much lacking representation in archives. And so Asian Americans are actually only 1% of archivists nationwide. So if you're looking at what histories are being cataloged, to what degree of cultural competency there is, and to what degree information is able to be gleaned out, and what kind of community trust there might be, we need to look at more diversity, not only within the ranks of who's collecting the data, who are the people going out there interviewing, who are the people who are processing it once it comes into an archive, but also incorporating that into the discussions that we have when we're looking at building digital projects. Are we talking to people who might be able to read the same interview and come up with different things that that might speak to them because they're familiar with that language or culture or history? And then also looking at information literacy. So if you're looking at data sources and availability and economics and funding, so are they able to look to, we have these ACRL, which is the Academic College and Research Libraries section of the American Library Association, which is a professional organization many of us are a part of. And we have these information literacy principles, and one of them is authority is constructed and contextual. So especially nowadays, we need to kind of critically think about where is the information coming from, what's being made available, what's not, how does that affect what we visualize or what we don't visualize, and how we're visualizing it. Are certain classes, socioeconomic classes of people, being interviewed more for a particular incident, for a particular trauma than others? Are people from a certain area interviewed more because those are the people who live near a memorial? Why are the sources and data sets that are available? And then also looking at advanced research strategies. So looking beyond kind of what is available, but partnering with archivists, with librarians, and with other people to look at how do we delve deeper and deeper into the research. So it's not just creating these digital scholarship projects that are great for 10 weeks or 16 weeks and come up with a snazzy map at the end, but also how do we incorporate emerging literacies so students can better understand what they're looking at and how they're visualizing it. And we've all seen bad visualizations, and we've all seen visualizations that seem to skew toward one particular interpretation or another. And how do we encourage students and people to be able to critically think about what they're looking at and to go beyond, oh, this really pretty map looks great, so therefore it must be some sort of objective truth. So I just wanted to kind of go through my process of what one example that I had. So I had the pleasure of going to one of Todd's classes at UCLA when I was teaching on, he was teaching on visualization using the VHA archive and the metadata he had gleaned from there. And I went in to talk about my Nanjing Massacre testimony experience. So in this case, when I'm thinking about how to incorporate emerging literacies, I'm thinking about how to scaffold into lesson planning reminders to be reflective and reflexive, and that's something that, you know, kind of thinking about where are our own biases as researchers or students kind of coming from, where that might be reflected of the archivists and all the mediators who are visualizers who are in between those steps of the research process, and what that might look like when you're working with different communities, particularly communities different from your own. The other thing is also giving enough time. I know it's hard, especially at UCLA with 10 weeks, but giving enough time to do background research on the data sources, looking at the organizational purpose, the funding, the methodologies, before the collecting and analyzing part. So I think depending on which departments you're in, sometimes there's more of an emphasis on the research part, sometimes there's more of an emphasis on the actual creation of the project, and it's hard within a 10-week period, which is why I think it leads me to the next point, which is partnerships with librarians and archivists for advanced research strategies and consultation. So obviously, I think as the librarian and the archivist here, I'm going to encourage you all to partner more with your librarians and archivists and to do more collaborative work like we were talking about earlier. But, you know, really kind of baking that into the preparation time. So it's not just, oh, you know, now's the time for a library visit because I'm out, you know, for a conference this week. Or, you know, I saw this really cool thing, now I want to implement it in 5 weeks and we have, you know, 5 weeks left of the quarter. But how do we work together with our various expertise and skills and strategies in order to look at kind of really scaffolding in all of these emerging literacies and thinking about the value systems and the methodology and the choices so that we're creating we're training scholars to be more cognizant of what they're looking at, why they're creating something, and then also being able to critically think about other visualizations and other types of scholarly work as well. So one example of that is with, as I mentioned, the Nanjing Massacre testimonies, and looking at the context is key. So some of the things I've thought about in terms of value systems and diversity is, I remember in one case, I was looking at the source, and granted, you know, the corpus isn't quite super large as the Holocaust testimonies, but I remember indexing some of them, and I noticed that in one of the testimonies, they were talking about bound feet. Now, unless you had a cultural knowledge of the fact that women's feet were bound when they were young and continually broken and bound, and that affects, obviously, how able you are to escape and to flee during the Nanjing Massacre, that's not necessarily something that would come up as a term or that would come up as something to flag. And so that's something where, you know, having sort of that content knowledge or cultural competency is able to help you pull out something that to someone else might just look like, okay, your feet was bound, maybe you hit your foot or hurt your foot that day. In terms of looking at the value systems, also thinking about in the Nanjing Massacre testimonies, there were oftentimes just the way they talked about family, you know, so knowing that people who were not necessarily related or sometimes called by familial terms. And so how do you index that? How do you understand what you're indexing so you don't index something incorrectly in terms of familial relationships between the people mentioned in the testimony? And in terms of methodology, I think one of the things that I found that was really interesting was that when I was indexing, I was part of the training was kind of realizing that you do biographical indexing first. So you're looking at the pre-interview questionnaire. And so one of the things about context is that the Nanjing Massacre testimonies are being recorded now and a few years prior. This is a lot later in life for these survivors than even when we started in the 90s for the Spielberg, for when it started out with Spielberg for the Shoah Foundation and when the survivors were recorded then. And so memories have sometimes faltered. The pre-interview questionnaire is not necessarily as extensive as the ones that were used for the Holocaust survivor testimonies. And so when you're indexing the relationships, there's not always as much information that's already written there. And when you're looking at, you're also looking at a lot of names that are not being mentioned. So they might say their mother, but they might not ever say the name, or they might say their sister, but they might not ever say the name. And so what ends up happening is that as an indexer, when you have a name, you always put that in the biographical indexing. When you have only the familial relationship, then you would index sisters as a term or brothers as a term. Now, I can imagine if someone didn't look at the methodology and didn't look at the cataloging indexing guidelines, they could visualize and, you know, maybe they would make an assumption like, oh, they talk about sisters and brothers so much in this group of testimonies than they do in that testimony. But that's because what is being collected or what information is available is different, and because of the guidelines and training that we're given as indexers. And that affects kind of the assumptions that you make from what you're drawing out if you're looking just at the metadata and not at the guidelines themselves. And then also just looking at the choices. What are the choices in terms of who gets to be recorded? They're primarily people who are closer to the memorial. They have some connection there. People who have maybe moved away aren't necessarily being recorded. So what are the choices of whose stories are available and what are we generalizing from that when we're making these visualizations. So I just want to talk a little bit about what is the work ahead. I think for me, thinking about my background working in Holocaust education, working as an archivist, and now as an academic librarian, I think one thing is looking at more transparency in the value systems, methodologies, and choices behind the data and the metadata we collect and how we use it, both from those who are creating the data sets and those who are analyzing the data. So for example, the VHA has the guidelines available on the website, right? So that kind of transparency from archives is looking at, and in finding aids, you'll often find who the archivist is, who is processing a particular collection at what time. So more transparency, I think, in those who are creating it and also those who are analyzing it. So if you are analyzing, if you're creating visualizations, videos, and maps, what are your methodologies? Is that kind of information being collected and being documented, and is that available to people outside of maybe like the grant funding proposal, right? And then also, of course, partnering together with librarians and archivists to incorporate and scaffold emerging literacies into digital scholarship projects. So it's not an afterthought after creating this project, but it's actually incorporated into it. I think a lot of times classes are short, quarters are short, and so there's a lot of emphasis on the content, there's a lot of emphasis on the project, but how do we tie all of those in together and incorporate these emerging literacies so that we're looking at archival literacy, meta-literacy, visual literacies, and looking at how do we teach students to become better scholars and better researchers who are going to be our future researchers and scholars as well. So, yeah, thank you, and let's continue to work together.
Also perfectly timed. Impressive, right? So we have 20 minutes for questions. So who would like to go first?
Thank you, Joanna. I was kind of intrigued by a very slight remark you made in the first third of your presentation when you said that certain collections are donor-driven, right? And this is kind of really, in a way, a problem when, so to speak, available money dictates what we collect, what we can analyze, which also eclipses what is not analyzed, yeah, and what we can't analyze. So I see this as a substantial problem in general for, let's say, digital studies, digital collections, because a lot is for the user, it is not obvious what is absent. We always see only what is available, and we are intrigued by what is available, but we don't think about what is actually not available. Yeah, and so I'm really, and when the availability is driven by donors, I think that's really problematic. So how do you respond to this as an archivist or as a digital librarian? Yeah.
Well, thank you for that question. I think, well, unfortunately, we live in a world where everything is always going to be partially donor-driven, but I do think that there are ways to look beyond that. So, for example, community archives, smaller nonprofits, there are always there's a whole range and whole in terms of sizes of organizations and of people who are committed to a particular community or trauma or history. And so I think making sure that we also look in a variety of places for a better, I guess, comprehensive look at what's available. So I think that's one way we can look at those smaller community archives, look at different initiatives that are being started within communities themselves to see if that's capturing histories that are not necessarily being funded or being prioritized in other places. And I think the other thing about it's true, it's not obvious what's absent. I think that's one place where you have a really good conversation with an archivist because they know what's in their backlogs, even if it's not out on a finding aid, even if it's not being processed, they know what's not gotten funded yet, right? So that's one way. But I think also that's where it comes in terms of looking at what does get funded. And so that gives you an idea of looking at, okay, if this is the trend, what might there be that's not covered by that? So I think that's where looking at the funding streams and looking at kind of organizational purposes and kind of looking, okay, where are those missing gaps and what might they have that other places might have, or that just are sitting in the shelves and haven't gotten the funding to be processed yet.
I'm going to ask the blunt, grumpy faculty question. So the last point you made, which is really that we need to include these kinds of emerging literacies in our teaching as well. So we have our content, but we also have our historiography, and you're going to my faculty and saying, and you want me to put something else in a 10-week or 15-week class. My faculty would say, well, you know, they learn German in the German department, and they bring it into our seminar, but it's over there. So how do you respond to that? I mean, and I think it's a real question in the sense of those of us that are trying to integrate the intellectual questions of digital literacy with the intellectual questions of our particular fields?
Yeah, that's a great question, Paul. I think there's a few things. I know at UCLA Library, we're trying to incorporate more things through, we have, aside from instruction, which I'll get to in a little bit, but we have video tutorials that we're trying to create. So those are things that we are trying to create in these kind of small, digestible ways to be able to be incorporated into your course management. So you can kind of plop in a video and make sure that your students watch it and answer a quiz at the end. So those are sort of smaller ways to kind of at least throw something at them, these smaller digital tools. I think the other thing is also workshops. You know, oftentimes we have workshops and they're available. We teach art, we teach Tableau, we teach a lot of different great workshops on cornerstone research foundation strategies and things like that. And we obviously get better attendance when faculty assign that as a assignment for their students. So that's another way outside of the class time where faculty can send their students and say, I want you to go to these 4 cornerstone research as part of your class. But in terms of actually incorporating, I think that's certainly especially when there's already so much packed in, I think that's where the collaboration and the partnership comes up is, are we able to have those conversations? It might even start with meeting the department, or maybe it starts with looking to the TAs, where the TAs are often in a course for training before they start any other TA, you know, maybe talking to them about what resources the library has and what opportunities there are to partner together. And then I think coming up with those lesson plans together. So I think my most successful projects that I've been able to incorporate emerging literacies in are classes where the instructor has come to me, you know, a quarter before, and we sit down and we say, okay, this is the project you have in mind. I know this is what you have to fit in, and they give me a draft of their syllabus, and I think, okay, let's work backward. If you want to create an online exhibit by week 10, okay, by week 7, they should be able to do this. By week 6, I should go in for a demo and a workshop on this. By week 5, by week 3. And so I think that's where the partnership comes in together, where it's not like anyone's trying to dictate how the class goes or trying to add more, but how do we make a more successful student project come out of what you're already teaching?
If I could just follow up, there's also a politics to that. As you were talking, I'm thinking, well, this is, those of us that are old enough, this was feminism in the 80s in art history, in which, you know, you really had to tell your, you had to tell your colleagues, well, I'm already teaching, you know, Monet and Manet, how can I possibly work in Eva Gonzalez? You know, so it's that there is a kind of intellectual question that is led by, that has to be, that argument has to be made, unfortunately. Also.
Yeah, and I think that's where all of you can help bring the message to your institutions. I think, you know, that's a very common situation that I think librarians and archivists are in, is trying to be able to say that what we have to offer is important to the students and that we should incorporate that and it's worth incorporating. You know, and I know for people who have taught classes for 15 years, why is it worth incorporating something else in? And I think that's where sometimes it's helpful to just target the TAs, the people who are grad students, you know, the people who are willing and need maybe some more help to work with, and then hopefully it's sort of a word of mouth thing. You see someone else doing something that's successful, and hopefully that kind of, you know, gets the word out too. Thank
you. Thank you for your presentation. I mean, this is very interesting, but I'm curious about your take on the relationship between what my university is called subject librarians and kind of the digital part of the library, because they're somewhat separate, at least in my case. So that, for instance, I teach Russian Soviet history, so if I would want my students to do some research, I would want them to work with data collections, like say posters, for instance, that are based in Russian, and in Russia. So I would kind of talk to my subject librarian and trying to help me identify some of those source collections. But she isn't necessarily the same person who would be able to teach my students how to work digitally in research, so conduct digital research, if you will. So I often have to make the choice. Do I talk to the person who knows the digital stuff, or do I talk to my subject librarian? If I talk to the digital person, I'm the one who provides the content. So that means I sit there and I search the internet for sources. If I go the other way, I have to figure out how to teach my students how to do the digital work. So what does UCLA library do in that regard? But maybe also other universities. I'd be curious to hear how you teach digital work if you don't work with quote unquote local sources.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, well, so at UCLA, we're big on the idea that we are one library. And I think, most universities have subject librarians and then more interdisciplinary positions like mine. But I do think that I would hope that the two librarians can actually work together. So if I was approached for a class like that, I have absolutely no Russian competency whatsoever, and I would reach out to our subject specialists in that regard, and we would work together in terms of looking at, okay, now how do we best provide with both of our expertise kind of coming in together, because we're going to, every librarian and archivist, they have different expertise, right? So I would actually suggest in that case that becomes a team where both of them work together to help out with that class. And I think that's happened with other classes. We had recently a medieval history professor reach out to us who was teaching on medieval legal history. And we actually, talking about scaffolding in, we actually had someone from the law library go in for a part of one session, and then someone from the digital scholarship center go in for another part of the session, and then someone who specializes in medieval literature. And so in that case, we all took the part that we could teach. And so in that case, it's helpful where the instructor is like, this is what I need from different expertise and skills, and this is how we can kind of work together. So we all met together, planned out those lessons, and then we taught different ones. And I think that's a collaborative strategy where we all recognize that we have limited skill set and limited competencies as well.
Last chance.
Thank you, and thank you very much for pointing out transparency and the importance of being transparent. And I'm just seeing this old man sitting on the other side of this room, and I don't see any chance of being transparent about how he was made, because the technologies that were used, Watson, AI, and so on, they will be way beyond of our understanding. So I think in this room, maybe 99% of the people will never understand the mathematical basis and the computing basis that created that old man. So I'm wondering then how to deal with transparency with this. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it depends on what kind of context or use it is, right? I think, if this is for a testimonial encounter, you don't necessarily need to talk about kind of how the whole new dimensions in testimony works. But if you were to put Pincus within part of a larger exhibit on ways to engage with Holocaust history, I think it would be pertinent to have some sort of exhibit label or something to explain kind of this is who Pincus is, this is what we've been able to do, and this is the purpose of why we think this is important. And I think it depends on the context of when you're using it. In this case, it's not like you want to put a picture next to him necessarily, but if it's part of some sort of display or if there's an educational component to it, I think that could certainly be incorporated. And I think another thing, too, is in terms of thinking about transparency, I often see kind of virtual reality, augmented reality, or reconstructions, 3D modeling of things. And I think what I'd love to see, and I'm already seeing more of, is kind of where are people getting the information in order to build these worlds or to build these different types of interaction. And it could be even starting with something as simple as citations, like, where is that information coming from what archival institutions, where is the GIS being grabbed from, and why did we choose these choose these data sets or information to take from. And I think sometimes it can distract from it, but I think there's always a separate place that we can make, and that's part of scholarly work, right, is to kind of see where we've gotten other information or to create and analyze the information that we've been given.
Hi, I'm a USC student, so I'm here because we're in the middle of researching ourselves. But how do you think the new removal of a lot of the books from college campuses is going to affect like these type of researches and databases? Because I just recently read the article from the LA Times talking about how UC Santa Cruz, I believe, just removed 80,000 books from their library to make more room for computers and study space, because students more rely on, I mean, I know I personally rely on the internet, and it's rare that I ever catch myself in the library actually fishing through books. So.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, so to a book lover and to just anyone outside of libraries, that sounds horrible, right? Like, why would we get rid of books? The reality is that every library you go to has to go through weeding projects. So, similarly, at some point, you're going to move and you're going to realize like half of these books are just in really bad condition, or they're completely irrelevant. So in some of those cases, we don't necessarily need outdated scientific journals or books, right? So I think some of it is just looking at what's still relevant and what's still needed in the collection. And then also looking at where, and a lot of times, we're going through weeding at UCLA sometimes too, and it's also duplication. So the numbers can sound horrible, but many times it's because it's outdated, or it's not in a great condition and we buy those books again, or it's duplications. The other thing is, at least at UCLA and most of the UCs, is when you remove books, the things that are still deemed kind of worth keeping around, we actually put into storage. So the northern UCs have an NRLF, the southern UCs have the Southern Regional Library Facility. So they're off-site so that you, all students and faculty, have a place to sit and to study and to use the spaces, but they're stored off-site so you can actually retrieve it and recall it within a day or two. So that's kind of some of the reasoning behind the weeding and the removal of books. The other thing is, I think one thing that's a common misconception is what the library provides. And so the library not only provides the books, I also buy for some of our collections, and they're great. I'm absolutely a fan of print books. But we also buy books for reserve, which are books that faculty put for 2-hour holds so that people have access. And we also do the databases. So everything that you're getting online is provided through the library too. And some of them will now come in the form of ebooks, or maybe they come more in the form of open access, which we're trying to always push for. But all of the publishers are negotiated through librarians. All of the databases that you get at UCLA, we have over 700 databases we have access to. That's all negotiated through librarians as well. So I think in terms of looking at the information that we have, is still tremendous. And we still have access to millions of books, and to have access to all of these articles and journals and databases. I think the other thing is that I'm looking at the services. So just as important, another part of the library is offering research consultations. So we need to have spaces to be able to talk to our faculty, to be able to talk to our students, offer writing help, and also just have spaces for students to be able to study and to be able to kind of exist in those spaces, because there's not always good or safe spaces to be able to study. So I think, and also to offer workshops, like I mentioned earlier. So I think with all of those things combined, I'm not necessarily worried, because those books that are needed will still be in storage. The books that need to be bought will be bought again. And so I think it's more so, how can we continue to best utilize those spaces and offer those students, and to also correct these misconceptions that the library is only useful when there are books, but there are a lot of other things that are being done. But yeah.
Thank you. Perfect timing. Automatic World, a forthcoming interactive memoir, Tomorrowless, which I can't wait to see, and the ongoing recombinant narrative project, If Then. Finally, Andrew Woolford is a professor of sociology at Manitoba and the former president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars, a very prolific author of several books, including This Benevolent Experiment, Indigenous Boarding Schools, Genocide and Redress in the US and Canada, which I'm sure we'll hear a little bit about today, The Politics of Restorative Justice, and Between Justice and Certainty, Treaty Making in British Columbia, as well as the co-author or co-editor of 4 other works. So, gentlemen.
Thank you. Just while, if I can have this mic while Adam moves to the podium. Just on behalf of our panel, I want to thank Wolf, America, Martha, and the Shoah Foundation for organizing this. And I also want to acknowledge that we're on Tongva and Tatavian territory. I apologize if I've left out any nations, indigenous nations, who were also on Los Angeles territory. But as part of our projects, it's important that we do this, A, because we're bringing indigenous knowledge to this region, and the survivors with whom we work would want us to do it in a respectful manner, but also because the issues we're talking about today, space, erasure, are ones that are very present here in this space, so we want to make sure that we start by acknowledging that. Thank you.
So I'm going to go first and then just introduce things, basically put a couple of down payments on issues that you may want to follow up with us about during the discussion. I'll turn things over to Andrew, who will give us some sort of broader context, both on our methodology and also on indigenous issues. And then we'll conclude with Struan, who will talk about the technical dimension of our project, some of the challenges we faced, the ways we've chosen to overcome them. And we'll conclude with video capture of the virtual world that we have, or in the process of completing, okay? And it's been an amazing conference, actually, because I've seen points of contact between our work, our project, and almost everything else, if not everything else, that's been discussed today. And I'm really grateful for the presentations that have preceded us. I had planned to make Andrew's, the sort of line from Andrew's earlier presentation on Cambodia, the point of departure for my discussion. He said, which itself was a reference to earlier discussions, he said, when you're in the space, you get a very different narrative. And I thought that was excellent. And then Joanna just said, you know, when we get, he asked the question, posed the question, where do we get the information to build these worlds? And I think our presentation, in a sense, is an answer to at least one answer to that particular question, which is a very important question. So in this project, we'll discuss the aims and methods of the Embodying Empathy project, a Canadian multidisciplinary public-private research and creative partnership that's working under the direction of Indigenous survivors to produce a digitally immersive experience centering on a representation of Canada's Indian residential school system. Embodying empathy is a complicated and, in different ways, a challenging undertaking that has several aims, one of the more significant of which is to address fundamental questions posed by recent developments in curatorial and commemorative practice, most especially those arising from the so-called experiential turn in heritage thinking and design. As exemplified by museums such as Washington, D.C.'s Museum and the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, which opened in Winnipeg in 2014, this experiential turn designates curatorial strategies aiming to produce enriching interactions between museum contents and museum goers, rather than occasions for quiet reflection, aesthetic appreciation, and/or education per se. Increasingly, museums are relying upon sophisticated digital technologies to facilitate and sustain these interactions, and part of what Embodying Empathy is being designed to assist with is determining whether or not some fairly major curatorial assumptions, such as that virtual experiences, through the feelings they elicit, contribute to durably altering people's moral or political dispositions, if these assumptions hold any water at all. Embodying Empathy is also, however, being created to serve as a model of living and decolonized heritage practice. The project's ownership, outcomes, and uses have only been minimally determined by its academic directors, the three of us, and we hope in this way to perform a particular way of thinking about what it means to work with and on Indigenous experiences. Indeed, through our work on embodying empathy, we're attempting to model a highly robust form of non-extractive scholarship that departs significantly in its fundamental orientation towards its objects from prior ways of working with and on Indigenous peoples and cultures. And I venture to guess that this was also quite different from the way Holocaust testimonies worked with and other kinds of testimonies worked with as well. Our project aims not just to resolve longstanding questions in the critical literature regarding the moral efficacy of immersivity in the digital domain. It is itself a museum-quality installation intended to provide those who experience it with a morally robust introduction to the perspectives of Indigenous children forced to live for years in educational facilities within which they were often cruelly mistreated, and the friends and family were, for the most part, unable to visit. In this way, embodying empathy is at one and the same time an attempt to describe an Indigenous experience of Canada's IRS, residential school system, and a thick attempt to theorize that description. The slide up here, just so you know, is just a representation of the various task groups that we've had to sort of pull together in order to get the project done. We can talk more about the specifics of these task groups, but the task groups concerned with, for example, design, technical design. We have a research task group led by a social psychology colleague who's actually doing evaluations, like a longitudinal study of the empathetic effects of immersion in the world. We have so just it's complicated. It's been very complicated. It's a multi-year thing, and we're nearing the end of the process, of this process. The Embodying Empathy project employs a modified and participant-led design protocol, which Andrew will talk about, which aligns with principles for working with and disseminating Indigenous knowledge developed by Canada's Assembly of First Nations, and known as OCAP, which obviously refers, as per the slide, to ownership, control, access, and possession. Our methodology actually exceeds OCAP principles, and in this way is also a kind of more robust ethical protocol insofar as OCAP typically addresses or covers the byproducts or the outcomes of research, whereas on our protocol, the ownership in question actually extends to include the methodologies itself, right? So, and I think I'd like to talk more about that, but I will maybe if you have questions, I can address that a bit later. I think, and here it's awkward because I had hoped to have a large screen to be able to read, and my eyesight is just not good enough to make do with the small capsule I've got there. So essentially what we've tried to do with the project, or what the methodology has allowed us to do, is we've been able to train Indigenous students in contemporary research methods. So, you know, it's allowed us to extend what we know into domains and work with people who might ordinarily not have been able to or interested in actually attaching themselves to these kinds of this kind of initiative. We have developed the project entirely in ways indebted to Indigenous perspectives. And as part of the decolonizing kind of impetus, we've attempted to represent as fully as possible, as you'll see, Indigenous perspectives into the world that we've built, and by so doing, by creating a project that is at once a kind of experiment and also a commemorative site. We hope to contribute important, and through the development of the new ethics protocol, et cetera, what we hope to do is contribute to ongoing processes in Canada of reconciliation and redress. And just before I go, I did want to talk very, very briefly about, what is this going too far? Yeah, so, it just seems to want to run. So anyway, like basically, I just wanted to say that we have a conception of empathy that actually exists in kind of that's drawn from the work of Dan Zahavi and other people, but that stands in a kind of marked contrast to the kind of smugly condescending view of empathy that we find in work like Paul Bloom's recent Against Empathy, right? For Bloom, there's a hard line between reason and empathy. For Zahavi and others, we see there being at least two kinds of empathy. Zahavi identifies on the one hand kind of parallel empathy, which is like a mirroring of feeling. And then we have reactive empathy, and reactive empathy is a richly cognitive component. It's deeply interpretive, right? So it's not in any way alienated from reason, and we're working within the idea, or within the category of reactive empathy, to try and sort of theoretically frame and understand the kind of the effects of our world in terms indebted to this conception. So I'll leave it at that. Just a lot of kind of down payments, and then turn it over to Andrew.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to need to be very brief here, so if you have questions at the end, if I leave out anything, please don't hesitate to ask. The residential school system as a system, missionary schooling has a long history in North America, but the system really begins around 1879 as a man by the name of Davin comes to the United States, studies the U.S. educational system, which is taking hold in the aftermath of the Indian Wars and expulsions, as they're seeing assimilation as the new way to deal with the quote-unquote Indian problem. In Canada, over 150,000 Indigenous children would go through these schools up until the closing of the last school in 1996. We know over 6,000 have died, but we don't have the full knowledge of how many people perished within these schools, but they were defined by poor conditions, neglect. Some students were even killed by the staff at the schools for various reasons. The schools were operated by Catholic and Protestant missionaries. The Canadian government funded these, but they put the control of the schools at the local level in the hands of these denominations. So these were sites of extremely poor nutrition, as I said, inadequate clothing, inadequate health care, the degradation of Indigenous culture, severing of the children from their family relationships, physical and sexual abuse, forced language loss. All of these things took place in order to decimate Indigenous cultures. So what we are doing here is combining a participant-led design methodology with decolonizing and unsettling methodological principles. So based on this, we've tried to uphold a principle of relational accountability with the survivor group, who are our governing council. They are the true leaders of the project. They are the ones who have all final decision-making power over this project. So this took a long time to build. Within the first year of the project, we did not make any movement towards building a virtual world. The first year was spent meetings and trust building. That was about it, with them interrogating us really about why us, why should we be the ones doing this project, how are we going to meet their interests and their needs, because that's a big part of community-based research in Canada these days, and I'm sure it's true in the United States as well. Based on this, the following year is really when we got into having during that trust building phase, we also opened up our methodology, opened up our ethics statements, opened up our planned outcomes. Everything we had written for grant purposes was basically thrown out the window and opened up to their revision. And so I had to put in several ethical amendments based upon suggestions they had about how they wanted this process to run. Then we began meeting as a group, having a collective discussion of the world, how it should shape, but in the way that they wanted it to go. So it was mainly them sharing stories amongst themselves, us standing back, listening, hearing what they had to say, and then trying to design something that we would then bring to them, which they would critique, have us revise, critique, or sometimes support. And it was a back and forth process like that in order to come up with the virtual world that you'll see part of today. But it's not a final world that you'll see today. This is one that is still going to be going back to the committee for further comment and revision. So relational accountability also meant, though, that we didn't just work on our project, the project that we had envisioned. They had other things they wanted us to do. They wanted us to throw a reunion for a residential school, so we participated in organizing a reunion. We participated in serving breakfast to a group of survivors in inner city Winnipeg. We went to talk to a local high school. We toured the sites with them. The project had to expand to include all of their interests, not just their interests as they relate to the project. I think that's an important point for when you're thinking about relational accountability with Indigenous groups and research. I'll stop there on the research that led to us building the world. The next stage of research is going to be our evaluation. Adam already mentioned that the psychologist who is participating in our project, who's not here today, she will be doing experiment-based studies of students who will run through and then be surveyed at 3 points in time to see the impact that this world has upon them. I'll also be doing more qualitative research based upon life world style interviewing to sort of get a sense of the ways in which they make meaning, understand themselves within the space of this world. That'll be with a different set of students, not the same ones who go through the world. I'm going to stop there. I probably went way too fast, but I'm quite conscious that we are short on time. So, Struan. You can go. Okay, yeah, sure.
Okay. All right. Okay, so what are some of the considerations? I'm going to give a quick recounting, very quick, blazingly quick recounting of some of the considerations as we built this world. Among them were that it had to be accessible, anyone needed to be able to use it, including communities that had very limited access to things like broadband, et cetera, and communities that were disparate, both urban and rural. It had to emphasize diversity of experiences and approaches, not just our group of survivors or one or two among our group of survivors, but as many as we could possibly embed in terms of the narratives we were using. Had to perhaps include a range of sites and historical materials. We had to decide whether we were building our world basing it on one site, one IRS site, or a number of them, more composite site, and included representations of persons and relationships. That was crucial, both within and without the IRS system. Spaces and soundscapes, sounds became increasingly important as we proceeded, of daily life, but also of aftermath. The IRS imprint, as it were, did not end when a student left the school. It persisted, and it was immensely, as you will probably know, destructive. So that too was part of the mission. Content directives were very clear. It had to be non-euphemistic. We weren't going to gloss over particular sets of experiences. We had to include those in the richest, but we also need to broaden our focus to include daily experience, not merely experiences of trauma, abuse, and so forth. And that the world would include integrated spaces for reflection, education, and healing. That you could leave the world temporarily and find resources that would allow you to reflect, but also to heal and then re-enter it. So here are some questions that have come up as we've built. What blend of technologies? And we used Unity as our baseline platform because it's inexpensive, it's fairly portable, and it's also pretty flexible. You can fine-tune it, tweak it, add modules, rewrite code, and so forth. The question then was, how should visitors be able to enter the story world? How do they navigate it? What are the principles of story world navigation? And how do they interact with it? And then I think also importantly, how do they leave it? One of the things we noticed very quickly was that our survivors were reluctant to enter the school. They didn't mind being in spaces within the school, but they didn't want to cross that threshold. That threshold was an important site of trauma for them. So we designed an alternate pathway that allows survivors to port where they want to go and never to have to cross that threshold. Similarly, when you leave the school, you enter a safe space, and you cannot be made to go back to the school at that point. So the safe space is cut off in space and time from that IRS. It becomes then the site of a possible site of redress and healing. So very quickly, we began with a blueprint, and we realized very quickly that the blueprint and the model could not be reconciled with the school that was built or the survivor memories of the space. They were radically different spaces. And so we decided to approach the space from their perspective of their memories and from their position within those memories. So you'll notice here how small you are. You're a child in this space. And also that some of the details that are part of the world are very intimate details. These crosses were made of metal by students in metal shop under the direction of a priest who had some facility with it. And they represent one texture that can be altered. Here's a shot of the dormitory, not from within, but from without, which helps to tell the story of split families, split siblings, schools who were boarders versus students who were day schoolers. If you look at the floor here, you'll see that there's a sort of greenish-brown deposit. That's the cleaning dust that was used by students often for hours at a time to clean those floors. Now, in one of our experimental builds, that dust becomes increasingly opaque until an image and a story can be registered upon it. It becomes a representational space itself. So, similarly, the rightmost window, if you press it, you're taken to the same same space, but another time, not 1952, but 1977, 1994, 1941. So it's flexible in terms of its spaces, but also its time signatures. At the same time, the weather you see is the weather that happens on October 25th, 1952. Okay, sunny, gusty winds, and so forth. So it's indexed to the real, but it is also crucially imaginative space. Ways of telling, there were some stories that could not be told in this space. Survivors could not speak them, and they were not even discussed in our interview sessions, which were noisy, busy, full of sound and changes of direction. They were not single party interviews, but discussions of the group among themselves. So one of the challenges we faced was how to import these sorts of stories that the survivors wanted in the world, but they did not want to hear or speak. So one of the decisions we reached with them was to make not just the objects in the world. This is an imported missile. It's been rebuilt three-dimensionally and inscribed with narrative text. But all the surfaces in this world are potentially story spaces. So walls can tell stories. Water in a sink can show a story. There are ways that you can leave your story behind as well within the space. I'm not going to talk about empathy, but I will before we show it, I will say one last thing. The space is partly autopoetic. It thickens as it's used. So one of the things you can do as a visitor to the space is leave something of yourself behind. You can leave graffiti on a chalkboard. You can leave food in the dormitories. You can also write in jam on a table in the refectory. You can speak into a recorder. And what you see and do and write and leave is, there's obviously limits on how thick it can get at the moment, but it's there for the next visitor in. So there are multiple layers, both of narrative from survivors, but also of responses from visitors to the space. So the space becomes increasingly thicker, and we're working on ways, whether we use something like a time-lapse schema, or whether we have hard limits for the number of objects or alterations that can be made. And what we can talk about more in the discussion. Now, what I'm going to show you is it's about 3 minutes long. This is when the camera sound has to go off, I'm afraid.
That is because we do not have permission from the survivors to have the testimony that's part of this include like
school, but you can't go back there. I think it's also an interactive space, and we can talk about that in discussion. Thank you very much. Sorry we ran long.
Questions?
Transfixed. I'm sorry.
We'll work with that one there.
So thank you very much. I wonder, since you talked so much about sensitivity with the survivors, do you have a version in non-English?
Yeah, not a full version yet, but several of the narratives, including the most recent set, are, well, that's in Anishinaabe. We also have Cree, some Cree narratives as well. And one of the things you'll notice as a visitor to the school is that the spaces where you can either hear or respond in either of those languages are very much restricted. There are only 2 of them. And in the rest of the spaces, to speak or to try to hear in the language of your choice is both prohibited and punishable. So yes, the short answer is yes, some of the narratives and certainly some of the written will be in either or both Anishinaabe or Cree, and that will be selectable potentially.
I just wanted to say that we have 3 different user groups that will be running through the school in order to assess the empathetic potential of the virtual world. And partly because, so we have we have intergenerational survivors, and we have, we're calling them naive users, people who have no particular understanding of the school. But in that context, it makes more sense to have our primary build focus on more English than not.
Yeah, but the survivors did make it clear in terms of the objectives of this study that this was not just for a settler population, this is for an indigenous population, so those languages need to be included.
Thank you for the presentation, and I think my question kind of echoes a little bit of what Wolf was trying to get at. For one, I think it's really great that you're trying to do this as an inclusive project, as community-oriented, participatory, and so forth. But at the same time, it sounds a little bit like you developed a project and then you approached the community. You mentioned kind of that you had the grant, you had the proposals, and then you had to kind of go back and adjust it based on what indigenous folks wanted. So did you talk to them before you wrote the grant? Is my first question. And the second question is actually about the title, Embodying Empathy. Because I think empathy is an affect, right? And so I think you're trying to produce an affect with this simulation. But you just mentioned that that you're targeting this toward 3 different groups. What kind of empathy do you want the survivors to develop there? Because when I think about empathy and the aftermath of systematic violence, I think about Theodor Adorno, who wrote in Education After Auschwitz that essentially in order to prevent another Holocaust to happen, we need to train people to develop empathy. Because if people can recognize other people as people, they cannot kill them, essentially. I mean, I'm butchering that a little bit right now. But where does the empathy come in for you here for the different groups that you just mentioned? And what do you actually understand by empathy? I'd like to hear a little bit more about that.
Okay, I'll start with the first question, because yes, we did consult. This project was based upon an existing relationship with a couple of survivors who wanted to expand it to include a larger group. So the primary survivor, who was our main liaison for forming the Survivor Governing Council, then went out and found the group. We spoke to them once before the application, but ultimately for a grant application, you have to put something down. So our grant application was pretty much saying we want an open process whereby the survivors are going to determine every step of the way. So very hard to get funding based upon that. So it took us a few different cracks at it before the main funding body in Canada, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, funded it because it was a very open and expansive. We weren't putting objectives on the paper at that point. We were saying the objectives, even in the grant application, the objectives were going to come from the survivors. And then we've always made sure we remain open to projects that the survivors would like to see branching off of this as well.
Yeah, no. So I think it's important to realize that the project arose at a very particular moment in Canadian history as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was inquiring into the residential school system, was preparing to produce its final report. And at the almost exactly the same moment, the first museum in the country located outside of the Ottawa National Capital Region was being built in Winnipeg, and it was a museum of human rights. And of that, in that museum, there are two permanent galleries. One, a Holocaust gallery, owing to the roots of the CMHR project in a failed attempt to get a Holocaust museum built in Canada. And the second was an Indigenous gallery. And so Andrew and I and another colleague were very much a part of a series of discussions with people who were in the part of the planning process of the museum. We had a idea of a human rights museum seminar run through the law school where we brought people in, and they were debating what the different parts of the museum would look like. And we were very interested in the Indigenous gallery. In particular, we were interested in how, in the CMHR, which is an ideas museum, so in an artifactual museum that's tech heavy, how they would go about approaching this. So we had this sort of general question, and then we started looking at the literature to see what the options would be. And then, and Andrew has had, he's sort of a specialist in Indigenous issues, written extensively on land claims, other issues. He had a series of conversations that preceded settler colonial issues, and he had been working. Thank you. He'd been working on this for some time before. And so, it really was. We overdetermined things as little as possible, but obviously we acted out of our own particular curiosities. But the project evolved really dialogically. Like it was as in my experience, the least top-down project of this kind I've ever been involved in.
Empathy?
I was just saying one very quick thing, which is that many survivors report not only estrangement from culture, from language, but from self. And so one of the first responses we had from one of the first survivors to go through this had to do with a recognition of self. That one of the things that she had found most difficult was to empathize with a version of her, not so dissimilar from survivor guilt, right? But to empathize with a version of her who had allowed herself to be instrumentalized by this IRS system, that she had not thought of herself in that way. She was now seeing herself in that way. So one of the connections that was possible for at least her was between her and herself. So it may seem like a fine-grained point, but I think it's an important one. Andrew can speak more about survivor empathy specifically.
You said what I was. I think that captures it.
I'm going to ask a poll question. But really, I have two questions. One is the question of audience. What are you hoping to get out, depending on the audience? Empathy. The general public is going to react differently than. So that's one question, the audience. The second is something that we struggle with our book on the geography of the Holocaust, and it's the aestheticization of. I see something beautiful here. It's very well done, very beautiful, and suffering, beautiful. Nice. I couldn't help noticing that the interior of the school was spotless, very, very clean. So it's this kind of the aesthetics of suffering. I think that it's interesting.
Yeah, I'll just quickly address that. So, that's, I think, a crucial question. And so two things. First of all, that one of the facts of at least this school was that the surfaces were often spotless because they were being relentlessly cleaned, polished, and remade by the students who were essentially slave labor at that point. So that's one. But also, one of the issues you face with any kind of unity structure is that you have this sort of shiny plastic surface. That surface is, and we need, when we go back to the survivors, one of the things we expect them to say is to let us know where those surfaces need to be degraded, where they need to be messed up, where noise needs to be introduced, not merely into the narratives, but into the space itself. And and there'll be a number of examples of that. The dormitory is one of them, where the first time you see the space, it is perhaps not aestheticized, but it's clean. But by the second time you go back there, it isn't clean anymore. It's overwritten. It's full of mess. You start to notice flaws in the surfaces. So one of the presumptions of the build is that you don't simply cycle through really quickly once, but that those who revisit will notice that the space has changed while they were away. So it's a live space. It's not a film. And the space is impacted not only by those who go through it, but by the number of times it has been gone through, and by what visitors leave, including from survivors down to general audience, non-native audience members leave behind there. But I mean, I think it is a crucial point. At every juncture, we've tried to avoid gamification. We've tried to not turn this into a point and shoot that also happens to be an IRS exemplar. But one of the things we have found with our intergenerational audiences is they want to see everything. They want to see, they want to see it both shiny and new, and they want to see it defaced. And they want to have the opportunity, in some cases, to deface it. And so it becomes, I mean, in that sense, it's both, a live space and a laboratory and a site of incipient destruction that's always just around the corner, if that makes sense.
Did you want something? I got the first question, so if you want to talk to this one.
I'm going to build on that. Just one brief thing, which is that it would be nice if evil places were sort of marked in some structural way as evil, but it doesn't work out that way. These schools are actually quite lovely. They used wonderful oak, and part of the experience that we've heard in talking to the survivors is when they showed up at the school as little kids, they were overwhelmed by the beauty of the place, and actually they were parked, and their parents actually they would be talking to somebody or kept in a state of isolation. When that ended, the parents were gone, and that was it. And then all of a sudden, they began to develop a different relationship to all of that beauty. But I mean, as Struan says, that those places were sparkling, and the landscape is quite beautiful too. I mean, we've done site visits, we've incorporated the real landscape into the environment around the school. So, I mean, yes, there's a tension there. But it's a tension in every, I think, representation of traumatic experience, right? I think at the end of the day, since we're asking the survivors to let us know what's acceptable and what isn't, we just have to go with that.
Yeah, it's interesting that cleaning food is a trigger for many survivors, the smell, so sort of speaks to this issue a little bit. On your first question, conceiving of this in an era of so-called reconciliation in Canada, which is a glacial and sputtering reconciliation if it's happening, we thought the primary audience, I think initially, at least in our own minds, not on paper, not presenting this to our group, but we probably thought in the mind that this was something to the audience were going to be settler Canadians who didn't know enough, who didn't understand enough, who didn't connect enough. But the survivor group was more focused on their grandchildren are the audience. They see their grandchildren engaging with video games, and they see this as a way of communicating to them stories that they were never able to communicate to them. And the students we've talked about in the Saugeen community, it's an Anishinaabe community not far from Winnipeg. They just say, our parents won't talk about this. We don't know. We don't understand what happened. We want the story. So they've really become, I think, probably a primary audience for us.
Can I just add one thing to that? There's been an interesting kind of tension developing between the expectations of the intergenerational audience and the survivors themselves. Insofar as the intergenerational survivors, they want warts and all, and the survivors still want to protect them. And so, negotiating that in terms of expected audiences, it's been really difficult and likely imperfect in all kinds of ways.
I'm going to follow up on the aesthetic because it's really interesting how there are different modes of kind of visualization here. I mean, you look at this and it's actually quite seamless. It's more or less a kind of a virtual world. But then those photographs pop up. Well, that's not a virtual world. That's an augmented world, right? And those photographs are highly realistic. I mean, they're reality in a virtual space. But then also you have a kind of you have an artificial world, a gaming world in which the religious figures come through that are clearly artificial. And so you have different kind of modes of realism. I mean that in a kind of big R, history of realism sense of the term. And what's that trying to get at?
I'm going to let you actually answer most of that, but I did want to speak to the religious figures issue because, I mean, there is obviously a stiffness and a mechanical quality to it, but I will say this, that I am still haunted by a story I can't share that involves the realization or the recognition, the awareness of one of our survivors as he was in the dormitory of these moving shapes at night, and frankly, and of sexual abuse in this context. And for him, as a small child, they weren't people, right? They were just these kind of eerie, ominous, inhuman shapes. So there's an expressionist element here too.
So yes, it's a mixed reality environment. It's not it's not simply virtual. It's not simply, there are painterly elements which aren't in this version yet, but there's a sort of painterly torque applied to figures like the nuns and priests, so that again, by the third or fourth time you glimpse them, they are much less sort of realistic, much more abstract. They're simply blobs of color with a cross, so indexically related to the figure of a priest or nun, but much more influenced by a memory. In terms of the photographs, they really come from a conversation I had with one of the survivors who had shown me photographs, and I said, that those are really, really interesting. He said, well, why can't they be put in there? And I couldn't think. It was hard to think of a reason why they couldn't be. And so, yes, they provide some continuity between the historical past and the re-experienced past, which is also the present. But I think they also perform a commemorative function. They are sort of references to, in many cases, to students who didn't make it, to survivors who did not survive so long. And the photographs are often perpetrator photographs, but not all of them. Some of the photographs are archival photographs taken by family members, et cetera, et cetera. And we'll see what they make of it now that they get to see them in the space. And photographs behave very differently in 3 dimensions, as you're probably aware, immersive VEs. One of the things our photographs do is allow you to enter them. So in the picture you saw of the floating nun in classroom, you don't just look at the classroom, you can actually go into the classroom. You can move between the seats. You can see where the nun ends and the floor begins, that space, that gap, which is a narrative rupture as well as a visual one. And you can then pass out of that photograph back into the world. So, there is some questioning of boundaries going on there, but I think ultimately it was always a mixed space that included fragment elements of memory, of culture, of familiar relationship, of language. So representing it as a fragment space not only does no harm to that, to the way it was, but also perhaps signals those ruptures more easily to us, if that makes sense.
In part, you've answered my question, but just to pick up on the religious figures element, I'm just wondering how you came to decide about the aesthetic of those. Presumably the survivors wanted them to be in that space, and whether conversely there was a conscious decision made by you or the survivors not to have other representations of other children in the space as well.
Yeah, those are both great questions. Andrew and Adam can also chime in. We actually had a group of 6 nuns that they could choose from. A palette of nuns, as it were, from which they could make choice. It sounds absurd, but one of the things we found is that they all remembered the nun figure differently. For some, they were helper. Not all, but for at least one of our survivors, the nun was a helper figure. At least one nun was. This is someone who seemed to her different, and so she never saw her with the habit, even though she wore it. She could see her face, whereas others have no recollection of faces. They see only the sweep of a priest's gown. So what you saw was, I hate to say it, but as those of you who work with IVEs will be, it's kind of what we had ready-made, the thing we made earlier. What you will see when you actually navigate the world are a number of different representations of not only, Catholic religious figures, but also Protestant ones. Several of the schools we're dealing with were Protestant schools as well. I've forgotten now it was a very interesting point, but I've forgotten it, I'm afraid.
Oh, about the children, about there not being other children present.
Yeah. It's, that's something we're still playing with. I don't think a decision's been made there. Partly, when you work with immersive interactive media, it's obviously a technical question. How do you want intelligent agents? Do you want non-player characters? What should the capabilities be? Should they be on tracks or should they be freestanding? What sorts of movement algorithms and speech algorithms, natural language generators do you want to include? At some point, and certainly this is a survivor-led intuition, it's the narratives that matter. And there's no reason why, instead of having other children moving around the space, we can't have their stories or their face on a wall that speaks to us. In other words, I think, not just us, with our paucity of funds, but they were very interested in how we could be creative with representations of their fellows. And I think we're still really pushing hard at that. I don't think there's an answer yet, at least not to me.
So just about the children, I think the children are there, I think they haunt the space. There's a spectral quality to their presence. They're in the photographs. They're in the stories that are told, that are experienced as one moves through the space. So, I think it's an absent presence in a way.
Yeah, no, I agree. I actually think that's a much more effective way of doing it. It was just kind of a was a provocative question, I guess.
So we're at 20 minutes for the discussion. Do you want Wolf to have another question or two? Okay, so.
Thanks. Seeing this, I immediately am drawn to Pincus, this and Pincus, and authenticity. And the issues that come up are, for me, the stylized aesthetic and the semiotic issue of the medium in both cases. You know, Pincus is speaking of horrors when he was 10, what, a little older maybe. This is the benign sort of King Pincus on a throne. You know, he's like, if I had known my grandfather, the genocide survivor, that's Pincus. And as a non-survivor, I'm receiving information from him, horrific information. But through that, I don't see Pincus 1.0. Bedraggled, horrific, bloodied, destroyed. And same in this story world, I don't see that. But it tells me, right? It tells me of what has happened, specifically to non-survivors. They are coming into a vernacular, knowing that this is a real tragedy, a space of real tragedy, similarly here. But those very same people are also in their, and there's a great deal of them, especially students, in their gaming world, who are seeing renderings of super horrific things. You know, how many people did they kill last week playing Halo? You know, so these issues, to me, bring up the question of what is authenticity, and does it matter? And what are we trying to say with this vernacular that is embedded and steeped in a technological aesthetic that is recognizable and is not challenging?
Well, I'll start and I'll lead. I'm not going to get to the heart of your question, but one way in which this is not Pincus, well, in my mind, this is not Pincus, is the OCAP principles, that this may never be seen in its full virtual version by a broad settler, full settler version, full virtual reality version by a broad settler audience unless the survivors approve. They own this. This is in their possession. They will determine where it's shown and when it's shown. So, I mean, that's a key principle of ownership that belongs to the survivors about whether or not they approve of this version of their story being told and where they want it to be shown and told.
So a good deal of my ambivalence about Pincus really has to do with the top-down, what I perceive as the top-down nature of the interactions that resulted in this particular design. It's not obvious to me that Pincus was instrumental in shaping the choices of where the cameras were going to be, how he was lit, and what questions he was asked, and so on and so forth, whereas ours is an acutely bottom-up consultative process, and as researchers, we're just deeply fallibilistic about the decisions we make, because any decision we make can be and has to be overturnable by the people whose lives we're representing. So I think, I think there's a family resemblance, yeah? But I think there's a profound ethical and procedural difference.
So I'm just going to address one quick thing. Again, many of you will be familiar with this term, but people who work with interactive design often talk about the concept of presence, right? Presence as a perception of a non-mediated technological space. With Pincus, Pincus perhaps comes to us. We are in our world, and Pincus joins us in it. In his more or less mediated way. In this story world, with the headset on, isolated from the natural world that you would normally perceive, including its scale, its soundscape, its colors, its shapes, how you can move, we really come to the survivors So we approach them. They may or may not tell us their stories. We see some of occasionally artifacts associated with them, the missile, which belonged to one of our survivors, which we then remade. We see pictures of them in some cases as the children they were, in various time slice points. So, I mean, to answer your question, I would say that there are differences, whether they're deal breaker differences, I don't think so. I think they both represent different but valid attempts to come to terms with disappearing venues of knowledge transmission, disappearing, bodies who can speak, and the need to preserve not simply testimony, not simply memory, but testimony and memory that is spoken by the person to whom the experiences belong. And I guess that, for me, outweighs the kind of quotidian difficulties which are always, if not solvable, are always, remediable with the next tech revolution, with the next platform change, with the next. I think we can work. That's a set of problems we can work at, but we can't work at the problems of a member of our survivor group who's passed away a month ago and can no longer speak. Like, that's an insoluble problem to me. The other things I feel like we can get closer to.
Hello. Well, I just wanted to say thank you for presenting, and I was just very impressed with the level of engaging with the community, both prior to the proposal as well as the time built in to take time to just build trust with the community. I thought that was really important. And I think, Andrew, you mentioned building trust, doing things outside of the scope of the project too, that it wasn't just a means to an end, but that you took the time to get to know that community, as well as the funding and training of Indigenous students. So it wasn't just the researchers doing, but people within that community. I'm curious about just the ways you'll continue to support that community and how that's sustainable. I don't know how long the funding lasts, or as you mentioned, technology changes as well. Like, what do you think are kind of future goals that are sustainable in terms of how to support a community for which the trauma continues to live through the generations? And then I'm also curious, I think something we hear often within academia is also critiques on sometimes scholars or academics kind of taking on marginalized communities and their traumas, but not necessarily working with that community. I'm really impressed with how you have worked with the community. How could you encourage other scholars to embody this empathetic approach that you've taken and to incorporate more of that in? And what are your thoughts on how to include more Indigenous scholars in the future in the project?
Sure, yeah. I'm going to have to there's a lot of questions there, so my brain is moving slower and slower as the day goes on. The continuation of the relationship is important. When you talk about a relational accountability, it doesn't end just because the funding ends. So, but the relationship, is there. We've visited, one of the survivors in the hospital when he was ill. We've been to the birthday party of another, gone to a hockey game with him. It's that everyday relationship that continues as, we help each other out in various ways. I think the reunion, though, was a big moment, and it sort of branched off into a new project. We assisted with a reunion at a school that many of them had gone to called Assiniboia, which is in Winnipeg, and then that led me to apply for new funding to research that specific school. And now we are working with a GIS and mapping people who are mapping the history of that school through stories, and the GIS people are telling me, okay, well, when you interview these people, make sure you have a map, and so we're getting all that data, I hope, and making it so that their history there at this particular school, which is a very distinct school, like it's not like Seguin, it was a high school. It existed at a much later period of the residential schooling era, so it was urban, unlike most of the schools. So it was right in a very sort of hoity-toity neighborhood in Winnipeg. So, and the residents around it didn't know it was there, didn't acknowledge it. So we've been interviewing the residents to see what they knew about the school, if they ever noticed it. And then we're able to map all of this, and we're also looking at the ways in which we can extend this virtually and through augmented reality. So we're both trying to find ways in which we can continue these projects, but then also bring in new researchers who can contribute to it. But there's another side of that. We're also helping them facilitating the creation of a commemorative marker that will go at the school as well, and just just using our resources to assist with these sorts of projects as they come up from the survivor group.
In terms of general scholarly relevance, I would just say it's incredibly hard to get money to do work like this, because you have to give up so much of the control of the project, and you can't specify outcomes. And given the kind of logic of grantsmanship, I mean, we got small pots of money, but we needed a couple $100,000 to do this. And, several kicks at the can, small pot, small pot, small pot, you get it eventually when you have something to show for it, right? And we're lucky that the Tri-Council, our NEH, NEA, whatever the science thing is here, that equivalent, it has become more progressive since 1996. They've tried. There's constantly revisiting their kind of ethics and other protocols to make more room for this kind of research. In Canada, no idea what it's like down here. I suspect it's not easy. And so I actually have very little to say about what to do in the face of that kind of inhospitability.
Hard research for students to take on too. So, yeah, you have to be tenured.
Well, please join me in thanking the panelists.
Thank you very much.
I hope that,